Dr. Mark Johnson had been alone at the research station for almost 3 months now. The isolation never really got easier, no matter how many times he told himself he was used to it. Out here on Kepler 442b, millions of miles from Earth, there wasn't much to do except work, eat, sleep, and stare at the alien sky through the reinforced windows. His team had been rotated back home 2 weeks ago, and he was supposed to leave tomorrow on the supply ship. Just one more night, he kept telling himself. He was sitting at his desk that evening, going through data files and thinking about how good a real meal would taste, not the freeze-dried stuff they served at the station, when he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind. But wind didn't sound like that. It was a low, pained growl that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the perimeter fence. The sound made the hair on his arms stand up. Mark walked to the observation window and pressed his face against the thick glass. For a moment, he didn't see anything except the dense forest that surrounded the compound. Then he saw it moving through the trees. His breath caught in his throat. It was a dragon. Not like the small, harmless lizard creatures they'd cataloged and studied. This was massive. Its body was easily the size of a transport vehicle, maybe bigger. And it was white, pure white like snow or bone. But what struck Mark most wasn't its size or color. It was how it moved. Every step looked like an effort. The dragon's shoulders heaved with each breath, and even from a distance, Mark could see its ribs pressing against its skin. This creature was starving. The dragon stopped at the fence and let out another cry. This time it wasn't aggressive. It sounded like pain. Like desperation. Mark's first instinct kicked in immediately. Protocol. He was supposed to lock down the station, seal everything, and radio for backup. There were procedures for this. Safety guidelines. Rules written by people who had never actually been alone in an alien world. His finger moved toward the alarm button on his desk. Then the dragon lifted its head and Mark saw its eyes. He'd spent 3 months studying the wildlife on this planet. He'd seen plenty of eyes, predator eyes, prey eyes, eyes that glowed in the dark. But these eyes were different. They held something he recognized. Something human, almost. They held intelligence. And underneath that intelligence was exhaustion and a kind of desperation that made his stomach tighten. Mark stood there for a long moment just watching the creature. It was clearly in bad shape. The white scales that covered its body were dull and cracked in places. Its movements were slow and careful, like every muscle hurt. This wasn't a hunting dragon looking for a meal. This was a hungry animal, desperate and weak. He made a decision. Later he'd probably realize it was crazy. Reckless. Dangerous. But in that moment he couldn't look into those intelligent eyes and do nothing. Mark moved quickly to the supply room. His hands were shaking a little as he gathered containers of protein paste and nutrient supplements. It was expensive stuff, meant for their own survival out here. Using it to feed an unknown creature would definitely get him in trouble with corporate. But he didn't care. Not right now. He approached the emergency exit door, and his hands hesitated for just a second. Once he opened this door, there was no pretending he didn't know something important. There was no unringing this bell. But the dragon's cry echoed in his ears again, and he pushed the door open. The air outside was cold and thick with unfamiliar smells. The sounds of the alien forest surrounded him. Chirps and clicks and rustles from creatures he couldn't see. Mark walked slowly toward the fence, keeping his movements smooth and careful. The dragon watched him the whole time, its large head tracking his movement with those intelligent eyes. He laid the containers out on the ground in a line, then backed away slowly. He didn't run. He didn't make sudden movements. He just stepped back, giving the creature space. The dragon moved toward the food with surprising quickness for something so weak. It lowered its massive head and began to eat. And it ate like it hadn't had food in a very long time. Desperate, hungry, grateful. When the dragon finished, it looked up at Mark. For a moment their eyes met. Mark saw something in that gaze that he would never forget. It wasn't just animal gratitude. It was recognition. Connection. The dragon had understood what Mark had done, and it understood what kind of person would do it. Then, as silently as it had appeared, the dragon turned and limped back into the forest, disappearing into the darkness between the trees. Mark stood there alone, his heart still racing, knowing his life had just changed in a way he couldn't yet understand. Mark hadn't slept well since that night with the white dragon. He'd kept the encounter to himself, not telling anyone at the station. Part of him wondered if he'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe exhaustion and isolation had played tricks on his mind. But he knew better. He'd seen those eyes. That intelligence. It was real. The next morning he packed his bags. The supply ship was arriving that afternoon to pick him up. His time on Kepler 442b was over. 3 months alone on an alien world was enough. He was ready to go home, ready to sleep in a bed that didn't rock slightly in the wind, ready to eat food that didn't taste like cardboard and chemicals. He was actually looking forward to leaving. Then the alarm screamed. It wasn't a quiet alert. It wasn't a simple notification on his screen. It was the full perimeter alarm, the kind that only activated when something massive triggered the sensors. Mark jumped to his feet, his heart hammering. He ran to the observation window, expecting to see the white dragon again. What he saw made him freeze. The dragon was back, but it wasn't alone. The massive white creature was moving slowly, carefully, almost delicately through the fence's outer gate. And cradled in its enormous claws, small, fragile, and skeletal, were 3 tiny dragons. Cubs. They were nothing like their mother. They looked sick, weak. Their skin was pale and dull, and they weren't moving much. One of them looked barely alive. The white dragon walked directly to the fence and, with surprising gentleness for something so powerful, placed the cubs inside the perimeter. Then it made a sound. Not a roar. Not a growl. It was a low, almost mournful call. A pleading sound. The dragon stood there, staring at the station, waiting for Mark. He knew it. Somehow, that creature had come back here specifically because of him. It had brought its family, its dying cubs, and it was asking for help. Dr. Johnson? His colleague, David, called from the other room. We've got movement on the perimeter. Should I initiate lockdown protocol? Mark's mind raced. He had maybe 30 seconds before David came to see what he was doing. Maybe a minute before the rest of the staff got involved. The evacuation team would arrive within hours. They had procedures for wildlife encounters. Hazardous animals. And those procedures didn't include mercy. No, Mark said loudly. It's just the local wildlife. Nothing to worry about. Let me check the sensors. He moved quickly to his quarters and grabbed his medical supplies. Antibiotics, nutrient solutions, anything that might help. He grabbed food from his personal stash. Then he did something that would definitely get him fired. He disabled the alarm system's notification to the main office. The cubs were in bad shape. Really bad. One of them was barely breathing. Mark worked through the afternoon, trying to keep his movements calm and steady while his insides felt like they were tearing apart. The white dragon watched him from beyond the fence, never aggressive, just watching. Waiting. By evening, the supply ship had arrived. His team was preparing his departure paperwork. They were packing the station's supplies. Everything was moving forward with the routine of evacuation. And Mark was running out of time. Pack it up, Johnson, Commander Rivera said, walking past his station. We're leaving at dawn. Make sure you don't forget anything. Mark nodded, but he wasn't packing. He was in the isolation room with the cubs, trying to get liquid nutrient into the smallest one's mouth. Its eyes were barely open. That night he made a choice that would change everything. He didn't board the ship. When Rivera came looking for him in the morning, Mark was still in the medical bay with the 4 dragons. The cubs were still weak, but they were eating now. The white dragon had come closer to the station, as if understanding that Mark needed time. What are you doing? Rivera's voice was cold. We're leaving. Now. I can't leave them, Mark said quietly. Those are unknown creatures, Johnson. Potentially dangerous. We have protocols. They're intelligent, Mark interrupted. And they're sick. Starving. If I leave, they'll die. The conversation got heated quickly. Rivera called it dangerous, irresponsible, a violation of safety procedures. She wanted to euthanize the dragons. It was the humane thing to do, she said. Clean and quick. No suffering. Mark refused. He stood in front of those cubs and refused. In the end, they left without him. Rivera filed reports. Corporate probably filed complaints. But by then Mark didn't care. He'd burned his career, his contract, his ticket home. But those cubs were alive. And the white dragon, the one with intelligence in her eyes and a mother's desperation, stayed at the fence, watching Mark work. Trusting him. And slowly, over the next weeks, all 3 cubs started to improve. They started to eat more. Their eyes became clearer. Their scales started to shine. Mark had made his choice. There was no going back now. The first week was the hardest. Mark barely left the medical bay. He slept on a cot next to the cubs, waking every few hours to check on them, to make sure they were breathing, to feed them when they were strong enough. The smallest one, the one that had looked half dead when Atlas brought it in, seemed to hang on by the thinnest thread. Mark spent entire nights just watching it, making sure its chest kept rising and falling. But slowly things began to change. By the end of the second week, the cubs were moving around more. They were curious, playful even. Mark would watch them explore the medical bay, sniffing at equipment, bumping into each other like puppies. One of them, the one with scales that had a faint blue tint, would try to climb onto Mark's lap when he sat down. He started calling that one Crystal just in his head at first. The most energetic one, always moving, always playing with the others, became Blaze in Mark's mind. And the quietest one, the one that had nearly died, he called Storm. As for the mother dragon, the massive white one who came to the fence every single day, Mark started calling her Atlas. He didn't know why that name came to him, maybe because she seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, just trying to keep her family alive. What surprised Mark most was how responsive Atlas became to his presence. He'd learned quickly that certain sounds calmed her. She recognized his voice. When he walked to the fence in the morning, Atlas would make a low rumbling sound, almost like purring but deeper. When he was upset or stressed, she seemed to sense it. She'd pace near the fence, making these concerned clicking sounds. And the cubs. They learned fast. By the third week, they were responding to Mark's voice. He'd call out, "Crystal," and the blue-scaled cub would come running, or rather waddle quickly in her clumsy way. He'd say, "Blaze," and the energetic one would jump around, excited. Even Storm, the quiet one, would lift its head when Mark spoke. That's when Mark started keeping detailed notes. He began documenting everything. Every interaction. Every sound. Every behavior pattern. He'd spent 3 months studying the passive wildlife on Kepler 442b, filling reports with data that nobody really cared about. But this was different. This was important. One night, during his 4th week of caring for the dragons, something extraordinary happened. Mark was sitting near the fence watching Atlas. The mother dragon was doing something unusual. She was making a series of sounds. Not growls or roars. They were more deliberate. Clicking sounds mixed with lower resonant tones. Click click whir. Click click whir. Then she'd vary it. Click whir click. Or click click click. And the cubs responded. They made similar sounds back to her, though less complex. Blaze would try to mimic the pattern, getting it wrong, and Atlas would repeat it slowly and carefully like she was teaching. Mark's hands were shaking as he grabbed his recording device. He didn't have fancy equipment anymore. The station's main lab equipment had been taken by the evacuation team, but he had a basic audio recorder. He held it up, capturing everything as Atlas continued her teaching session with her cubs. It took him 3 days to analyze the recordings properly. He wrote out the sound patterns, looking for structure, for any hint of language. And it was there. Unmistakably there. The clicks weren't random. They had patterns. They repeated. They varied in ways that seemed intentional. When Atlas made a certain sequence, the cubs responded in specific ways. She was teaching them something. Rules. Patterns. Language. Mark sat at his desk, staring at his notes, and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just intelligent animal behavior. This was sentience. This was a civilization. Atlas and her cubs weren't just surviving on this planet, they were communicating. They were teaching. They were building knowledge and passing it down. He walked back to the fence that evening and he looked at Atlas differently. She was waiting for him as she always was. The mother dragon tilted her head, studying him with those ancient-looking eyes. "You trusted me," Mark said quietly. "You brought your family here because you knew I would help. You knew I would understand." Atlas made that low rumbling sound again. The purring noise that Mark had come to understand meant she was calm. Content maybe. Or relieved. Over the next few days, Mark started trying to recreate some of the sounds Atlas had made. His human throat couldn't quite manage the clicking parts, but he could do some of the lower tones. When he tried, Atlas would go very still, listening intently. And sometimes she'd respond. Not in anger or confusion, but like she was encouraging him, teaching him. Mark realized then that Atlas hadn't just brought her cubs to a safe place. She'd brought them to someone who could understand them. Someone who could learn their language. Someone who could be a bridge between two worlds. And that changed everything Mark thought he knew about his purpose on this planet. Mark heard the shuttle before he saw it. The sound cut through the alien sky like thunder and his stomach dropped. They were coming back. Not to help him. Not to support his work. They were coming to shut him down. The corporate evacuation team landed at dawn. 4 officials, 2 security personnel, and a medical officer. They looked efficient, professional, and completely unimpressed by anything Mark might have to say. The lead official, a woman named Director Patterson, walked straight into the station like she owned it. "Dr. Johnson," she said, not bothering with any pleasantries. "You failed to board the last transport. Your actions violated multiple safety protocols. You're being extracted immediately for psychological evaluation." Mark had expected this. He'd had weeks to prepare. Every moment he wasn't caring for the dragons, he'd been documenting, recording, building a case. "Before you take me anywhere," Mark said calmly, "I need you to see something." Patterson didn't look interested, but protocol required her to listen. Mark led them to the observation window where the dragons were waiting outside. Atlas stood with the 3 cubs clustered around her, all of them visible in the morning light. Even from a distance you could see how much healthier they looked compared to weeks ago. "That's the reason for your insubordination?" Patterson's voice was flat. "Animal welfare? Johnson, those are unknown creatures. They could be dangerous. Standard procedure is—" "They're intelligent," Mark interrupted. He handed her a tablet loaded with his documentation. "Genuinely intelligent. Sentient. Watch this." He played the first video. It showed Atlas with her cubs, repeating the clicking language patterns while the cubs mimicked her. He played audio recordings of the sounds, analyzed and transcribed with frequency breakdowns showing the complexity and repetition of structure. Patterson watched, her expression unmoved. But the medical officer, Dr. Hayes, leaned closer to the screen. "That's linguistic structure," Hayes said quietly. "Those aren't random sounds." "Exactly," Mark said. "They're teaching their young language. Knowledge transfer. That's not animal instinct. That's culture." "It's interesting," Patterson said, handing back the tablet. "But not enough to justify." "There's more," Mark said. He'd saved his best evidence for this moment. "I need you to observe a behavioral test. With your permission." He didn't wait for approval. Instead, he went to the fence and called out to Atlas. The dragon lifted her head immediately, recognizing his voice. Mark made a specific clicking sound, one that Atlas had taught him meant, "Come here, it's safe." And Atlas came to the fence, bringing her cubs with her. The security personnel immediately tensed, hands moving to their weapons. But Mark raised his hand, keeping calm. "Watch," he said. He placed his hand on the fence, and Atlas gently lowered her massive head until her snout was level with him. The mother dragon made soft clicking sounds, and the cubs crowded around Mark, letting him touch them. Crystal actually climbed onto his lap, making small purring sounds. Blaze nuzzled his hand. Even Storm, the quiet one, came close enough for Mark to stroke its scales. The entire time Atlas watched Mark with absolute trust. She could have crushed him with one swipe. She could have protected her cubs by attacking. Instead, she allowed a human she'd met only weeks ago to touch her family. "She's protecting them," Hayes said, his voice filled with wonder. "But she's not afraid of you. She's trusting you." "That's emotional bonding," Mark said. "Not just animal instinct. That's a mother protecting her family and choosing safety based on past experience with an individual. That's intelligent decision-making." Patterson's jaw was clenched, but Mark could see something shifting in her eyes. Doubt maybe. Or calculation. He played one final video. It showed Atlas solving a problem. The cubs had knocked over a water container and Atlas figured out how to right it, then showed the cubs how to drink from it properly. Not luck. Not random behavior. Problem solving. "Send that footage to corporate," Hayes said, looking at Patterson. "This needs to go to the scientific community." "Absolutely not," Patterson replied. "This goes through proper channels. We'll file a report and headquarters will decide." But it was too late. Mark had already uploaded everything to the station's communication system the night before. Every video, every audio recording, every analysis. Everything transmitted to the research networks on Earth with a timestamp showing when it was sent. Patterson's face went white when she realized what he'd done. Within 6 hours, the footage had reached the first research centers. Within 12 hours, it had gone viral across the entire scientific community. Scientists were demanding immediate investigation. Universities were calling for preservation of the species. The media was calling it the greatest discovery in human history, proof of intelligent alien life. Corporate couldn't pull back. They couldn't bury it. The world was watching. Patterson's orders changed. The evacuation was cancelled. Instead of extracting Mark, they were sending reinforcements. The outpost was being redesignated. No longer a research station. Now it was humanity's first official first-contact diplomatic post. And Mark Johnson, the man they'd wanted to fire for psychological evaluation, was being named chief liaison to an alien civilization. As Patterson delivered the news, her voice tight and professional, Mark looked out the window at Atlas and her cubs. The mother dragon seemed to sense something had changed. She made a long resonant sound, not a call but something deeper. Something like hope. Mark realized then that his life would never be the same. None of their lives would be. 6 months after the footage went viral, Mark stood on the observation platform of what was now officially called the Kepler Diplomatic Station. Everything had changed and nothing had changed at all. The compound looked the same. The forest beyond the fence looked the same. But the meaning of it all had shifted in ways Mark was still trying to understand. The station had grown. Scientists had arrived from a dozen countries. Linguists, biologists, anthropologists. They came with equipment and theories and questions. Some of them were skeptical about Mark's work at first. They wanted to run their own tests, verify his findings, make sure he wasn't just seeing what he wanted to see in the dragon's behavior. But Atlas and her cubs didn't care about scientific skepticism. They cared about consistency. They cared about Mark. When the new people arrived, Atlas had been cautious. She'd kept the cubs closer, made fewer of the teaching sounds. But Mark had introduced them carefully, slowly, always with Atlas's permission. He'd learned that you couldn't force understanding between species. You had to earn it. You had to show respect. That first week, when one of the scientists suggested they should study the dragons in a controlled environment, separate them for observation, Mark had felt anger rise up in his chest. But he'd kept his voice calm when he said no. Atlas wasn't a specimen. She was an individual. A mother. Someone who had made a choice to trust humanity, and that trust couldn't be broken for the sake of convenience. The scientist had pushed back, citing research protocols. But Mark had walked to the fence, and Atlas had come to him immediately, the cubs clustering around like they always did. The scientist had watched, really watched, and something in his expression had changed. He'd seen what Mark had known all along. This wasn't an experiment. This was a relationship. Over the months, the dragons had taught the humans so much. Atlas had shown them which plants were safe to eat, which ones were poisonous. She'd led a team of researchers to a hidden grove where unique crystalline minerals grew, materials that could revolutionize human technology. Blaze had shown them water sources. Crystal had led them to caves filled with ancient fossils, a geological record of Kepler 442b's entire history. But more importantly, they taught humanity something deeper. There were other dragon communities on Kepler 442b. More than a dozen, Atlas indicated through her communications with Mark. They were organized. They had territories. They had knowledge passed down through generations. They weren't just intelligent. They were civilized. And they could have destroyed the human outpost in the first week if they'd wanted to. Mark thought about that sometimes. Atlas could have attacked when Mark first fed her. She could have seen the station as a threat and organized her kind to eliminate it. Instead, she'd done something harder. She'd reached out. She'd taken the risk of trust. "We need to expand the diplomatic protocols," Mark told Director Patterson one afternoon. She'd stayed on as administrator, her initial skepticism replaced by something like reverence for what was happening here. "What do you have in mind?" Patterson asked. "We need to reach out to the other dragons. Establish formal treaties. Share resources, knowledge, technology. This isn't just about studying them anymore. We need to build a real relationship. A partnership." Patterson nodded slowly. "That's going to require approval from Earth. From multiple governments. It won't be quick." "I know," Mark said. "But it's the only right way forward." The process was slow, but it worked. Within a year, formal contact had been established with 3 other dragon communities. Within 2 years, there was a comprehensive cultural exchange. Dragons visited the station. Humans learned their language more fluently. Blaze, now a young adult dragon, had actually traveled to Earth, carefully, safely, with Mark as her constant companion. She'd become humanity's ambassador, showing crowds of people that intelligence and civilization existed in places they'd never thought to look. Mark remembered standing with Blaze in front of the United Nations building in New York. The dragon had looked at the towering structures with what Mark could only describe as curiosity. And when delegates from every nation on Earth had filed in to meet her, Mark had felt something profound shift in humanity's understanding of itself. They weren't alone in the universe. And they never had been. But the most important discovery wasn't about dragons or technology or scientific advancement. It was simpler than that. It was about what happened when you chose compassion over fear. When you saw intelligence instead of threat. When you took a risk on another living being's potential. One evening, months later, Mark sat with Atlas and her now-grown cubs near the fence. Storm had become the most vocal of the 3, making complex clicking patterns that Mark could now understand meant story or history. The dragon was asking Mark to tell him something about Earth. Mark described forests like the ones here but different. He described oceans deeper than anything on Kepler 442b. He described cities filled with billions of humans, all trying to survive, all looking up at the stars and wondering if anything was out there listening. Atlas made a soft sound, that purring rumble that meant contentment. And Mark realized something that made his eyes sting with unexpected emotion. She'd been looking for humanity. That's what she'd done when she came to the fence starving. She could have gone anywhere. There were other food sources on this planet. But she'd come to the human station because she'd sensed something in the humans, something worth the risk. And one man, tired and lonely and far from home, had recognized her courage enough to answer it with his own. That single moment of kindness had rippled outward like light. It had changed how humanity saw itself. It had changed how they would move forward into the universe. They would go with outstretched hands instead of weapons. With curiosity instead of conquest. With the understanding that intelligence takes many forms, and that the greatest discoveries come not from studying others, but from learning to live alongside them. Mark looked up at the alien sky, at stars he couldn't recognize, and smiled. This was home now. Not because he'd chosen to stay, but because he'd chosen to care. And that choice had made all the difference.